To have a full context of what I will present in this video, please watch the prior 5 episodes of this series. I will be making my case based on the arguments I have already laid out. Regarding the proper interpretation of the creation account as recorded in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, there are at present two prominent ideas. The first is that Genesis documents the creation story of a young earth. The second is that it documents the story of an old earth. The first position is represented by the individuals we have encountered over the course of this series: Ken Ham, Jason Lyle, Del Tackett, John MacArthur, and others like them, as well as the organizations they are affiliated with, such as Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International. The second position is represented by people like Hugh Ross and William Lane Craig, and their respective organizations, such as Reasons to Believe. For most believers, the conversation about Genesis 1 is between these two perspectives. However, I believe that limiting the discussion to these two perspectives does not accurately represent what the Bible is communicating and why. In this video, my aim is to substantiate this before offering a fuller interpretation of the creation narrative later in the series. Even though the young earth and old earth interpretations offer opposing conclusions regarding the age of the earth, they both share some common assumptions. The most fundamental is that both positions assume an absolute scientific element to the narrative of Scripture, that God has revealed in a scientific way how the universe was created. Thus, for the Bible to be inerrant in its testimony of creation, its literal record must be scientifically reconcilable. In the words of Pastor John MacArthur, quote, "The Bible gives a clear and cogent account of the beginnings of the cosmos and humanity. There is absolutely no reason for an intelligent mind to balk at accepting it as a literal account of the origin of our universe. It is not in conflict with a single scientific fact. Science has never disproved one word of Scripture, and it never will. It is not, as many suppose, at odds with science. True science has always affirmed the teaching of Scripture." As we have already looked at, though, there are instances in Scripture where a historical account must be parsed in a manner that is free from the assumptions of the modern scientific world. Some of these include the Second Commandment's reference to, quote, water under the earth, the record of Joseph's famine covering, quote, all the earth, Luke's testimony that people from, quote, every nation under heaven were represented at Pentecost, Paul's testimony that the gospel had been preached to, quote, all creation, and James and Jesus' testimony that, quote, the sun rises, among others. As previously outlined, these passages, and others like them, are true according to the categories of observational language, words spoken by people living on Earth at various times and places in history, under the cosmological assumptions of the ancient world, without all of the knowledge we have today. If these biblical passages are interpreted according to scientific literalism, then they are all wrong. But believing scholars of all persuasions regarding the creation narrative affirm that it is inappropriate to interpret these passages, quote, according to standards of truth and error that are alien to its usage or purpose, and, quote, that inerrancy is negated by phenomena such as a lack of modern technical precision or observational descriptions of nature. Thus, to suggest that a particular passage of Scripture, of historical narrative, may be written in a manner of ancient observation or ancient cosmology that is no longer in accord with modern scientific understanding is not to suggest that the Bible is wrong. It is simply to acknowledge that God has accommodated His revelation to the language and culture of a particular people. It is my position that Genesis is neither young earth nor old earth, because I do not believe the creation account was revealed by God in a manner to express a scientific, material understanding of creation. Rather, it is revealed in accordance with the assumptions held to by Moses and the Hebrews living in the late Bronze Age, having come out of ancient Egypt. If this is true, though, then how can this be demonstrated? In the previous episode of this series, we examined an interpretation of the temptation of Jesus as recorded in Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 4 by Answers in Genesis. The temptation of Jesus is a historical account, not a poetic or prophetic one. Nonetheless, Answers in Genesis acknowledges, in light of some differences between Matthew and Luke's accounts, that, quote, either or both accounts of the temptation of Christ may be treated thematically rather than chronologically, and that to do so would be to, quote, interpret Scripture in terms of Scripture, without violating the Bible's truth or inerrancy. Part of the reason for this suggestion is rooted in the material absence of a, quote, very high mountain that would allow for, quote, all the kingdoms of the world to be literally seen from a single point of observation. Answers in Genesis has used modern scientific understanding to help interpret this passage. Likewise, Answers in Genesis has also used a modern scientific understanding to correctly interpret Joseph's famine as being multi-regional, even though the scriptures testify of it encompassing, quote, all the earth. Thus, when we encounter an artifact of ancient assumptions about the world in Scripture that has been proven to not be absolutely or scientifically true, that is a clue to us that such a passage may be written in a manner that is observational to the original author or audience and/or according to a particular theme the author is attempting to communicate. If my position that the creation account is written in terms of ancient observational assumption rather than modern materialistic science, then there should be one or more of these literary artifacts preserved in its record. With that in mind, I want to turn our attention to Genesis chapter 1 verses 6 through 8. This passage reads, quote, "Then God said, Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the expanse, and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning, a second day." Remember that the justification for a young earth interpretation of the Bible, as stated by John MacArthur, is that the young earth interpretation is supposedly, quote, what a straightforward reading of Scripture plainly teaches, and that, quote, there is absolutely no reason for an intelligent mind to balk at accepting it as a literal account of the origin of our universe, because, quote, it is not in conflict with a single scientific fact. Given this hermeneutic, we have to ask a few questions about this passage. What, literally and scientifically, are the waters below and above the expanse, above and below heaven? Indeed, what is the expanse itself? In his book, The Battle for the Beginning, Pastor John MacArthur gives the following interpretation of this passage. Quote, "The imagery of Genesis chapter 1 verse 6 is that of a vast expanse, a protective layer that overlays the earth and divides the waters below, the sea of water that covered the earth, from the waters above, which could refer to atmospheric water, clouds, and water vapor, or it might describe some kind of ice crystal or water vapor canopy that encircled the antediluvian world. In other words, the expanse in between, the firmament, includes the Earth's breathable atmosphere. This interpretation of Genesis chapter 1 verses 6 through 8 is rooted in the early days of the modern young earth creationist movement among Western evangelicalism, as outlined in The Genesis Flood by Henry Whitcomb and John Morris. If the expanse is referring to the Earth's atmosphere, then the issue with this interpretation is that verses 14 through 18 refer to the sun, moon, and stars as also existing within the Earth's atmosphere, which we know is not true. Thus, the expanse or firmament cannot be merely a reference to Earth's atmosphere, as MacArthur and many young Earth creationists insist. Moreover, we still have the issue of, quote, the waters above the expanse. If the waters above the expanse referred to a, quote, ice crystal or water vapor canopy that encircled the Earth, we have sent satellites and spaceships into outer space and they have never encountered such a thing. Some young Earth creationists suggest that this water canopy doesn't exist anymore because God used it to supply water for Noah's flood. However, Psalm 148 verse 4 makes reference to these waters as still in existence after the flood. So, if the interpretation of MacArthur and others who hold to like positions is correct, this water canopy should still exist and be observable. Yet, it is not. It's apparent from the reading of verses 14 through 18, though, that the expanse includes astronomical bodies beyond the bounds of Earth's atmosphere inside of it. Thus, according to the Bible, the expanse includes what we would call outer space, which poses another interpretive problem. Instead of there being a water canopy around the Earth, the Bible seems to be suggesting that there is a kind of cosmic ocean that encloses outer space, or the universe. If we work backward to verse 2, it is these waters that exist before the creation of anything else, even light. Thus, the waters are not merely a reference to a global ocean that covered Earth. They exist beyond the bounds of the astronomical bodies that are enclosed by the expanse or firmament, the sun, moon, and stars. This understanding is affirmed in Proverbs chapter 8, verse 27. Quote, "When he established the heavens, I was there. When he inscribed a circle on the face of the deep." The interpretive issues deepen when we look at how the Bible describes the characteristics of the expanse. The Hebrew word translated as expanse in the New American Standard and as firmament in the King James Version is rakia. Verse 8 says that, quote, God called the expanse heaven. The Hebrew word for heaven is shamayim. This word can also be literally translated as sky, and many English translations use this rendering. An interesting observation is that the Hebrew word for water, mayim, is present in this word, which further indicates the concept that heaven or the sky exists within some kind of great cosmic ocean. Job chapter 37 verse 18 records Elihu's rebuke of Job, describing, quote, the skies strong or hard as a cast metal mirror. Job himself shared this assumption, as he describes God as walking, quote, on the vault of heaven. A perspective also held by the prophet Amos, who said that God is, quote, the one who builds his upper chambers in the heavens, and has founded his vaulted dome over the earth. Indeed, returning to Proverbs 8, verse 28 tells of the firm skies above. The assumption was that if heaven existed in the midst of cosmic waters, the expanse or firmament needed to be solid in order to hold those waters back. However, when it rained, there were openings in the expanse to allow for water to pass through. Quote, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. The word translated as floodgates is the Hebrew aruba. Literally, this word means windows. This rendering is preserved in the King James Version and the English Standard Version. If we are going to affirm that Genesis chapter 1 verses 6 through 8 is to be interpreted in the plain sense scientific literalism espoused by John MacArthur, Ken Ham, and other young earth creationists, then we are left with the Bible teaching us that there is literally a solid expanse that encloses heaven or the sky, that the sun, moon, and stars exist within the same expanse as birds and the other elements of Earth's atmosphere, and that outside of the expanse is a great cosmic ocean of literal water. Obviously, if these are meant to be absolute scientific truths, then the Bible is wrong. In the same way, if James and Jesus are literally, scientifically, teaching that, quote, the sun rises over the earth, that Joseph's famine literally covered, quote, all the earth, that people from literally, quote, every nation under heaven were represented at Pentecost, that the gospel had been literally preached to, quote, all creation, then the Bible is wrong in these areas also. However, remember that none of these other passages, all of which lack allegory or poetic license, have ever caused honest readers of the Bible to claim that it is wrong in these statements. The reason, as outlined previously, is because these passages are properly understood native to their original context, and the cultural observations and assumptions that existed in that context. James and Jesus are not wrong to say that, quote, the sun rises, because they are speaking observationally, not scientifically. Moses was not wrong to record Joseph's famine as covering, quote, all the earth, because he is speaking with reference to the known world of a Middle Eastern person living in the late Bronze Age. The same goes for Luke and Paul, who wrote as men living in the 1st century under the Roman Empire. None of them knew about East Asia, Australia, Europe, or the Americas, and it would be ahistorical and out of context to hold them accountable to our modern understanding of the Earth's continental landmass. So, returning to Genesis 1, with recognition of what the Bible is describing as the expanse or firmament, as well as the surrounding cosmology, instead of reverting to the position that the Bible is wrong because it doesn't literally exist, is there something within the native ancient context of Genesis that can help explain what is being described? Remember that the context of Genesis is the context of its human author, Moses. Moses lived somewhere around 1400 to 1500 BC, in a world dominated by the ancient Egyptians and their neighboring powers. Indeed, Genesis was written after the Hebrews had been delivered from their period of bondage in Egypt, prior to the revealing of any of God's laws or commandments in the Torah. In Moses' day, there were no discussions of evolution, Charles Darwin, or any of the modern scientific fields. Thus, it's worth looking at how the ancient world of the late Bronze Age, in particular of Egypt, viewed the world and the greater cosmos. In consideration of the cosmology of ancient Egypt, the predominant texts are the Heliopolitan cosmology, the Memphite theology, and the Hermopolitan cosmology, named as such in reference to the cities that they come from, as well as support from the pyramid texts, coffin texts, and what many commonly refer to as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, among other sources. The creator god in the various accounts was changed relative to the chief cult centers of the city the myth originated from. In Heliopolis, it was Ra or Atum. In Memphis, it was Ptah, and in Hermopolis, it was the primordial gods of the Egyptian Ennead, Later texts from the New Kingdom would give credit to Amun, chief god of Thebes. Quote, although there is no one authoritative description of creation, and the various accounts provide different perspectives, they are consistent in their basic version of how creation came into existence. The creator god was believed to have emerged from the primeval ocean and created his offspring from his own physical substance. The act of creation thus generated diverse, differentiated elements out of unity. Broadly speaking, these texts paint the following cosmological view. Quote, together, sky, land, and the duat, or underworld, comprise the world of the ancient Egyptian, a kind of bubble of air and light within the otherwise unbroken infinity of dark waters. These elements form the background to the Egyptian understanding of the cycle of life and human destiny, determined by the daily drama of sunset and sunrise. They are also the starting point for all Egyptian speculation on the origins of the universe. This quote-unquote bubble of the ancient Egyptian worldview is represented in the depictions of their gods, Geb and Nut, earth or land, and sky or heaven. Geb, being the land, lays supine, while Nut, his wife and sister goddess, stretches herself out over him. Depictions of Nut's body often include the stars, as she is the representation of the fixed firmament or expanse the ancient Egyptians believe covered the earth. Within the space between them stands Shu, the deified personification of the air, or what we would call the atmosphere. The solar disk is also often depicted, in attachment with either Ra or Amun, two of the chief sun gods of Egypt, or even the pharaoh himself, as he prepared for his journey to the afterlife. Compare this to the picture painted by Genesis chapter 1. The earth or land exists underneath the covering of the rakia, the expanse or firmament, within which exist the sun, moon, stars, clouds, and birds. This quote-unquote bubble was formed by God in the separation of, quote, the waters from the waters. My contention, and that of those who would agree with me, is that Moses, having been raised as an Egyptian himself and leading out the Hebrews, who have been in Egypt for generations, wrote Genesis in language that would have been native to his own cultural assumptions. Quote, we are not suggesting that Moses merely borrowed from Egypt. Rather, we are suggesting that Moses is starting with the Egyptian assumptions about creation to correct Israel's theology of creation, and not their way of talking about creation. There is clearly a correlation between the Egyptian material and the biblical account. We would expect this if Israel did indeed have a history in Egypt, as the Old Testament claims. As he did in many other places of Scripture, God accommodated the truth of his revelation to the limits of the knowledge of the people who originally received that revelation. God did not see fit to correct literally and scientifically Moses when he said, quote, all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. Nor did he when Luke wrote of, quote, men from every nation under heaven being represented at Pentecost, or Paul when he claimed that the gospel had been preached, quote, in all creation. Likewise, God did not scientifically correct the assumption of Moses and the Hebrews that the sky was a solid dome that separated the earth from a great cosmic ocean, or that the sun, moon, and stars existed in the same realm as birds and clouds. Neither Moses nor the Hebrews were in a position to understand such things, because they lived in a world absent submarines to explore the oceans, planes to explore the sky, rockets to explore outer space, microscopes to observe atoms, or telescopes to observe distant galaxies. Instead, God's point is to reveal to the infant nation of Israel that He, and He alone, is the creator of all things, not any of the gods or goddesses of Egypt, or any of the other nations of the world. Quote, that we do not retain the cosmic geography of the ancient world that featured a solid barrier holding back waters does not change the fact that our understanding of the Creator includes His role in setting up and maintaining a weather system. The material terms used in Day 2 reflect accommodation to the way the ancient audience thought about the world, but it doesn't matter what one's material cosmic geography might look like, primitive or sophisticated. The point remains that on the second day, God established the functions that serve as the basis for weather. Thus, my belief of Genesis is neither that it is a literal scientific proof of a young earth or an old earth. Rather, it is an account written for the primary purpose of revealing God's power and role over creation to a nation that has been inundated in Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern paganism. It is an account written in contemporary observational language, based upon the common cross-cultural assumptions about what the Earth and universe were at the time. Moreover, It is an account organized thematically rather than purely chronologically, in order to serve as both a theological witness for God and a polemic against surrounding pagan ideas. Many of the discussions common to interpreting the creation narrative, such as the length of the days, a possible gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, light before the sun, the time needed for Adam to name the animals, etc., misses the point if we do not first acknowledge that Genesis is an inspired product of the Late Bronze Age, being composed in accordance with Late Bronze Age assumptions. With that being said, we will look at a full examination of Genesis 1 in Chapter 7.